I thought I was just being funny when I joked that he was travel size in bed. It was a silly comment, made between bites at dinner, nothing serious. But I had no idea how badly those words would hit him. The night ended with me standing outside my own house, the locks changed, my calls ignored, and then I found out he'd sold my car without telling me. We'd gone out for dinner at this little Italian place we liked. Nothing fancy but good food and a relaxed atmosphere. It was a Wednesday night, so the restaurant wasn't too crowded, just busy enough to feel lively without being overwhelming. We'd been having a normal conversation about work and weekend plans when somehow the topic shifted to one of my co-workers who'd been bragging about her new boyfriend. She'd been going on and on about how amazing he was in bed, how he was so much better than her ex, really graphic details that made everyone in the office uncomfortable. I was telling Marcus about how inappropriate she'd been, imitating her dramatic gestures and over-the-top descriptions. We were both laughing at her ridiculousness, and I was feeling particularly witty and entertaining. The wine probably didn't help my judgment. The conversation had turned into a broader discussion about workplace boundaries and oversharing. Marcus was being his usual thoughtful self, making intelligent observations about professional behavior and social norms. But I was feeling restless, wanting to be more provocative and edgy than the conversation was allowing. Maybe it was the wine, or maybe it was just my need to be the center of attention. But I started pushing the conversation toward more personal territory. I made comments about how my coworker's boyfriend probably wasn't as amazing as she claimed, how people always exaggerated their sexual experiences to make themselves look better. Marcus was playing along, agreeing that people often embellished these kinds of stories. He seemed relaxed and happy, enjoying our playful banter about other people's relationships. He had no idea that I was about to turn the conversation directly on him. I should have recognized the warning signs in my own behavior. I was feeling that familiar restlessness that usually preceded me saying something I'd regret. I was looking for a reaction, wanting to shake up the comfortable dynamic between us with something shocking or provocative. That's when I made the comment that would destroy everything. Between bites of my pasta, I couldn't help myself. I said that honestly. Compared to her stories, Marcus was travel size in bed. I laughed, thinking it was playful banter, a clever way to reference both his physical attributes and the fact that we'd been talking about my co-worker's exaggerated tales. But Marcus didn't laugh. The change in his expression was immediate and devastating. The warmth drained from his face, replaced by something cold and hurt that I'd never seen before. The easy conversation we'd been having died instantly, replaced by a silence so thick I could practically taste it. I immediately realized I'd crossed a line, but my instinct was to double down rather than apologize. I told him not to be so sensitive, that it was just a joke between partners. I even laughed again, trying to recapture the light mood we'd been enjoying moments before. But Marcus just stared at me, his jaw tight and his eyes distant. He asked for the check without finishing his meal, his voice flat and emotionless. The drive home was silent except for the radio, and I could feel the tension radiating off him in waves. The silence in the car was suffocating. I kept glancing at Marcus, hoping to see some sign that he was starting to get over it, but his profile remained rigid and cold. His hands gripped the steering wheel with unnecessary force, and he stared straight ahead like I wasn't even there. I kept trying to break the ice, making small talk about the restaurant, or asking if he wanted to watch a movie when we got home. But he responded with single-word answers and didn't look at me once during the entire 20-minute drive. The restaurant had been only 10 minutes from our house, but Marcus took the long way home, adding an extra 10 minutes of excruciating silence to the journey. I couldn't tell if he was trying to avoid getting home or if he just wasn't paying attention to where he was driving. Every red light felt like an eternity. Every stop sign was another opportunity for me to try to restart the conversation, only to be met with that same cold silence. By the time we pulled into our driveway, I was starting to feel genuinely panicked about how badly I'd miscalculated the situation. When we got to the house, Marcus went straight to the bedroom and closed the door. I could hear him moving around in there, opening and closing drawers, but when I knocked and asked if he wanted to talk, he told me he needed space to think. I figured he was sulking and would get over it by morning. We'd had disagreements before, and while he could be moody sometimes, he'd never stayed angry for more than a day or two. Marcus wasn't the type to hold grudges or punish me with extended silent treatment, but this felt different. The door stayed closed all evening, and I could hear him on the phone with someone, speaking in low tones that I couldn't make out. When I pressed my ear to the door, trying to figure out who he was talking to, I caught fragments of conversation that didn't make sense. Something about keys and paperwork and appointments. We'd been together for 3 years, not perfect, but stable. I thought I knew him. I was wrong. Marcus and I had what I considered a solid relationship built on honesty and being able to joke around with each other. We lived together in his house, which he'd bought before we started dating. My name wasn't on the deed, but I'd been paying half the mortgage and utilities for 2 years, so I felt like it was our home, not just his. I'd always been the type of person who says what's on her mind. My friends called it refreshing honesty, but looking back, maybe it was just tactlessness disguised as authenticity. I prided myself on being direct, on not playing games or dancing around sensitive topics like other women did. Marcus seemed to appreciate this about me, at least initially. He said he loved that I wasn't fake or manipulative, that I told him exactly what I was thinking instead of making him guess. But maybe what he actually loved was that I hadn't yet turned that brutal honesty on him in a way that really mattered. The physical side of our relationship had always been adequate. Marcus wasn't the most impressive man I'd ever been with in that department, but he made up for it in other ways. He was attentive, caring, and genuinely interested in my pleasure. We had a comfortable intimacy that worked for both of us, or so I thought. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't sometimes think about past relationships where the physical connection had been more intense, more overwhelming. Marcus was sweet and gentle, but he lacked the raw passion and physical presence that some of my previous partners had possessed. My ex before Marcus, Jake, had been completely different in that regard. He was confident, assertive, and definitely more generously endowed. Our physical relationship had been intense and passionate, even if everything else about him had been problematic. Jake was unreliable, selfish, and emotionally unavailable, but the chemistry between us had been undeniable. Sometimes, late at night, when Marcus was sleeping peacefully beside me, I'd find myself remembering what it felt like to be with someone who filled me completely, who made me feel small and overwhelmed in the best possible way. I'd quickly push those thoughts away, reminding myself that good sex wasn't everything, and that Marcus offered me stability and emotional security that Jake never could. But those memories lingered, creating a quiet dissatisfaction that I tried to ignore. I told myself that physical passion fades anyway, that what Marcus and I had was more mature and sustainable. I convinced myself that I was being shallow for even thinking about such things. It wasn't something I dwelled on or felt the need to address. Physical compatibility isn't just about size, and our relationship had so many other strengths that I figured the bedroom situation was. Until that night at Romano's, I spent the evening watching Netflix on the couch, expecting him to come out eventually so we could talk about what had happened. Every few minutes I'd pause the show and listen for sounds from the bedroom, hoping he was ready to discuss things like adults. But he never did. When I finally went to bed around midnight, he was already asleep, with his back turned to me, clearly not interested in any kind of conversation or reconciliation. The space between us in the bed felt like an ocean, and I lay awake for hours wondering if I should try to apologize or just give him more time to cool down. The next morning, I woke up to find Marcus already gone. His side of the bed was cold, which meant he'd left early, probably before dawn. There was no note, no text message, no indication of where he'd gone or when he'd be back. I checked the bathroom and found that his toothbrush was missing, along with his contact lens case and the expensive face wash he used every morning. His gym bag was gone from the closet, but most of his other belongings seemed untouched. It looked like he'd packed for a few days away, not a permanent departure. I assumed he'd gone to work early to avoid talking to me, which seemed like typical Marcus behavior when he was upset. He'd always been conflict avoidant, preferring to withdraw and process his feelings privately rather than have difficult conversations. But there were signs that morning that should have worried me more than they did. The house felt different somehow, like something fundamental had shifted overnight. There was a stillness to it that went beyond Marcus's absence, an emptiness that suggested something more permanent than a temporary sulk. I went about my normal morning routine, getting ready for work and expecting to find a text from him eventually. Maybe an apology for being dramatic, or at least an indication that he was ready to discuss what had happened like adults. I made coffee for 2 out of habit, then poured the extra cup down the sink when I realized he wasn't there to drink it. I ate breakfast alone at the kitchen table, where we usually shared the morning news, scrolling through my phone instead of talking about our plans for the day. The quiet was unsettling in ways I couldn't quite articulate. Marcus wasn't usually chatty in the mornings, but his presence had always been a comforting constant. Without him there, the house felt too big and too empty, like I was rattling around in someone else's life. But there were no messages. My texts to him went unread. My calls went straight to voicemail. By lunchtime, I was getting genuinely worried. This level of silence wasn't like Marcus even when he was upset. I tried calling his office, but his assistant said he'd called in sick and wouldn't be available. When I asked if she knew when he'd be back, she seemed uncomfortable and said she didn't have any additional information. Something about her tone made me suspicious. Marcus rarely called in sick, and when he did, he usually told me about it first. The fact that he'd made this decision without any communication felt ominous in ways I was trying not to acknowledge. I decided to leave work early and go home to see if he was there, maybe sick or just needing space to cool down. The drive home felt longer than usual, and I found myself rehearsing what I'd say when I saw him. I'd planned to give him a sincere apology, to acknowledge that my comment had been cruel and unnecessary. I'd tell him that I loved him and valued our relationship more than some stupid joke. I'd promised to be more thoughtful with my words and more considerate of his feelings. But when I got to the house and tried to use my key, it didn't work. At first I thought maybe the lock was sticking, or I was using the wrong key somehow. But after trying multiple times and checking all my keys, the reality hit me. The locks had been changed. I stood on the front porch of what I'd considered my home for 2 years, unable to get inside, feeling completely bewildered. This had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe Marcus had called a locksmith for some other reason and forgotten to give me new keys. I called him repeatedly, but every call went straight to voicemail. I texted him explaining that I couldn't get into the house, asking him to call me back immediately. But hours passed with no response. That's when I noticed my car was missing from the driveway. I'd parked it there the night before, like I always did, but now the space was empty, like the car had never existed. My heart started racing as I walked around the house, checking to see if maybe I'd parked it on the street and forgotten, but it was nowhere to be found. I called the police, thinking maybe it had been stolen, but they told me I needed to file a report in person and provide proof of ownership. When I went home to get my registration and insurance papers, I remembered that everything was locked inside the house I could no longer access. That's when the full scope of what was happening began to dawn on me. This wasn't some misunderstanding or overreaction to our fight. This was deliberate, calculated, and designed to leave me completely stranded. I called Marcus's work, but his secretary said he'd taken a few days of personal leave and wasn't expected back until the following week. I tried calling his brother, but got no answer. His parents lived in another state, and I didn't have their contact information memorized. By evening, I was sitting on the front steps of the house I'd been living in for 2 years, with nothing but my purse and the clothes I'd worn to work. I had nowhere to go, no way to get there, and no access to any of my belongings. I finally swallowed my pride and called my sister Emma, who lived across town. She came to pick me up, her face a mixture of concern and confusion, as I tried to explain what had happened. Emma let me stay in her spare room, but her expression grew more troubled as the details of my situation became clear. She kept asking what I'd done to provoke such an extreme response, and when I told her about the travel size comment, she went quiet in a way that made me defensive. Over the next few days, I tried everything I could think of to reach Marcus. I showed up at his office, but security wouldn't let me up to his floor. I waited by his gym, but he never appeared. I even tried contacting mutual friends, but they all claimed they hadn't heard from him and seemed uncomfortable discussing the situation. That's when I found out about my car. Emma had been helping me research my legal options when we discovered that Marcus had sold my car to a used car dealership the morning after our dinner. The paperwork showed that he'd forged my signature on the title transfer, something that should have been illegal but was hard to prove after the fact. The car had been in both our names because Marcus had co-signed the loan when my credit wasn't good enough on its own. Technically, he had the legal right to sell it, even though I'd been making all the payments for the past year. The violation felt almost as devastating as being locked out of the house. That car represented my independence, my ability to get to work and take care of myself. Without it, I was completely dependent on others for transportation, trapped and helpless in ways I'd never experienced before. But the worst part was realizing how carefully Marcus had planned all of this. The locks hadn't been changed on impulse. He'd called a locksmith before I'd even woken up that morning. The car sale hadn't been a spur-of-the-moment decision. He'd driven it to the dealership at dawn and completed all the paperwork while I was still sleeping. This wasn't the reaction of someone who'd been hurt by a thoughtless comment. This was the calculated response of someone who'd been waiting for an excuse to destroy my life completely. I started to understand that Marcus had probably been planning this for a while, maybe months. The travel size comment hadn't caused his reaction. It had simply provided the justification he needed to execute a plan he'd already been considering. Maybe he'd been looking for a way out of our relationship and hadn't known how to end things cleanly. Maybe he'd been resentful about me living in his house without legal rights, or angry that I'd never committed to marriage despite our long relationship. Or maybe my comment had simply revealed something about his character that I'd never seen before, a capacity for cruelty that he'd kept hidden until the perfect moment to unleash it. Either way, I was left to deal with the consequences of one thoughtless joke that had apparently justified destroying every aspect of the life we'd built together. The legal situation was complicated and expensive. Because my name wasn't on the house deed, I had no legal right to be there, even though I'd been paying half the expenses. Because Marcus was on the car title, the sale was technically legal, even though it felt like theft. I could have hired a lawyer and tried to fight for compensation, but it would have cost thousands of dollars I didn't have, and there was no guarantee I'd win. Marcus had been careful to keep everything technically legal, even if it was morally reprehensible. My friends were sympathetic, but clearly uncomfortable with the situation. They didn't want to take sides, and several of them seemed to think I must have done something worse than I was admitting to provoke such an extreme response. The travel size comment became a source of shame, rather than the harmless joke I'd originally thought it was. When I tried to explain what had happened, people would get that look. The one that said they thought I'd brought this on myself with my big mouth and cruel sense of humor. Maybe they were right. Maybe I had been needlessly hurtful, attacking Marcus in his most vulnerable area just to get a laugh. Maybe my idea of honest communication was actually just cruelty disguised as authenticity. But even if my comment was wrong, his response was disproportionate and devastating. He'd taken a moment of thoughtlessness and used it to justify destroying my housing, transportation, and sense of security all at once. I spent 3 weeks at Emma's place, sleeping on her couch and borrowing her car to get to work. Every day, I hoped Marcus would contact me, that we could have some kind of adult conversation about what had happened and figure out a way forward. But he never called, never texted, never showed any interest in resolving the situation or even explaining his actions. It was like I'd been erased from his life as completely as if our 3-year relationship had never existed. Eventually, I had to accept that this was permanent. Marcus wasn't coming back, wasn't going to explain himself, wasn't going to help me recover from the devastation he'd caused. I was on my own, starting over from nothing because of one stupid joke. I found a tiny studio apartment I could barely afford and bought a used car with money borrowed from Emma. My new life was a significant downgrade from what I'd had with Marcus, but at least it was mine. No one could lock me out or sell my belongings without warning. But the experience changed me in ways I'm still processing. I became more careful with my words, more aware of how much damage a thoughtless comment could cause. I also became more guarded in relationships, less willing to trust someone completely or give them the power to destroy my life. The worst part was that I never got closure. I never understood if Marcus had been planning this for months, or if my comment had genuinely triggered such an extreme reaction. I never learned whether he felt guilty about what he'd done, or if he thought I deserved every bit of it. All I knew was that one moment of poor judgment had cost me my home, my car, my relationship, and my sense of security. A two-word joke, travel size, had unraveled 3 years of shared life in less than 24 hours. Looking back, I can see that our relationship probably had deeper problems that I hadn't recognized or addressed. Maybe Marcus had been unhappy for a long time and was looking for an excuse to end things dramatically. Maybe my pattern of thoughtless comments had been building resentment that finally exploded. But even if our relationship was doomed, his method of ending it was cruel and destructive in ways that went far beyond what my comment had deserved. He could have broken up with me, asked me to move out, even ended things angrily, but leaving me homeless and carless without warning was vindictive in ways that still take my breath away. 6 months later, I'm still rebuilding my life from the wreckage of that night at Romano's. I have a small apartment, a reliable used car, and a job that pays enough to cover my basic expenses. It's not the comfortable life I had with Marcus, but it's stable and entirely my own. I learned that my safety and security should never be dependent on someone else's goodwill. I learned that words have power and consequences that can't always be taken back. And I learned that sometimes people you think you know completely can surprise you in the most devastating ways possible. But mostly I learned that a single moment of thoughtlessness can destroy everything you've built, everything you thought was solid, everything you believed you could count on. And all because I thought it was funny to call him travel size. Now, I'm the one locked out, left wondering how I let my mouth get me here. The joke was on me, and the punchline was my entire life falling apart.